Okay, I think we can start. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for being with us today. This is our event, Shifting Dynamics in the Middle East, Turkey's Repositioning in the Region, organized by Contemporary Turkish Studies at LSE and the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy. I'm going to chair the event today. I'm a European politics professor here at LSE. I'm also the chair in Contemporary Turkish Studies at the European Institute at LSE. As you all know, yesterday was the anniversary of Hamas's attack on Israel, resulting in over 1,200 deaths and 251 hostages. This act of terror was followed by an Israeli invasion and incursion into Gaza, leading to more than 41,000 deaths, more than 100,000 injuries, and 2 million displaced individuals, mostly civilians. When we were planning for this event in the summer, we were, of course, deeply saddened by all the deaths and the loss of lives and the ensuing human tragedy. We were also concerned that the worst was yet to come, and unfortunately we were proven right. In September, Israel attacked Hezbollah in Lebanon, initiating an incursion that resulted in thousands of more deaths already and displacements of millions again. Iran responded with 180 ballistic missiles targeting Israel, similar to its previous strike in April, with Hezbollah also continuing to launch attacks across the border. But these are just numbers, and these are things that we already know and follow from media. And our thoughts and our prayers are with every single civilian, innocent person and child caught up in this terrible war in the Middle East. I don't think there's any way we can understand or reflect what is happening in the war zones at the moment, sitting comfortably in our chairs in this room in London. In fact, I don't think we will even make an attempt to describe the events in detail and focus on the main actors of the war. Instead, what we will do, and we know that this is not going to be enough by any shape or form, but we will discuss what all of this means for another regional power, Turkey, given that as a research group, our expertise is on Turkey. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, let me make a few brief announcements. This event is being recorded at the moment, and we are planning to make it available as a podcast, and if the technology allows us, it can also become a YouTube video. After around 40 minutes of initial interventions, 10 minutes each for each of our speakers, we will open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand and wait for the roving microphone when we open the floor to questions and to pose your questions to the speakers. We will have a reception afterwards once the panel is over, so please stay for that as well. After these brief notes, let me now introduce our panelists in the order that they will make their initial interventions. Our first speaker will be Sir John Jenkins, who is a former British diplomat with a 35-year career, mostly serving in the Middle East, including as ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Burma, and as Consul General in Jerusalem. He led the UK's 2014 Muslim Brotherhood Review and was director for the Middle East and North Africa at the FCDO. He is now a senior fellow at Policy Exchange and a consultant at Cambridge University's Centre for Geopolitics. In his initial talk, Sir Jenkins will give us an overview of how the regional dynamics and alliances changed in the Middle East since the start of the war in Gaza. Our second speaker will be Dr. Dimitar Bechev, who is a lecturer in Russian and East European Studies at Oxford University, a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and the director of the Dahrendorf Program on Europe in a Changing World at St. Antony's College, Oxford. His research focuses on Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Turkey, and Russian foreign policy. He has authored numerous books. The most recent ones are Turkey under Erdogan, which was published 2 years ago, and Rival Power, which was published in 2017. In his initial intervention, Dr. Becce will provide an overview of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East until 2020. Dr. Selin Nasi will pick up from where Dr. Becce will leave as our third speaker. Dr. Nasi is a visiting fellow at the European Institute here at LSE, and she's specializing on Turkey-Israel relations and the Middle East. She's also the London representative of the Ankara Policy Center and the non-resident fellow at the Center of Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, EDAM. Both of these are well-known and reputable, I would say, institutions in Turkey and their think tanks. Dr. Nasi will discuss how the Turkish foreign policy reset since 2020 has shaped its Middle East strategy and in what ways Turkey's pursuit of strategic autonomy influences its objectives today. Our final speaker will be Dr. Ziya Meral, who is a lecturer in international studies and diplomacy at SOAS. He's a senior associate fellow at Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a visiting fellow at the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Center, and co-founder of the Climate Change and Insecurity Project. Dr. Meral authored How Violence Shapes Religion in 2018, and 2 other Turkish language books. In his initial intervention today, he will discuss how Turkey's military engagement and defense strategy are shaping its role in the Middle East. Now I will hand over to our first speaker, Sir John Jenkins, for his talk.
Thank you very much, Professor. It is quite hard to know what to say about this conflict in the Middle East because it is so distressing and clearly so emotionally charged. But the function of policymakers, of which I was one once, and commentators, is to try and make sense of the structural issues underlying this conflict and other conflicts in the region, because it's not the only conflict in the region. This war has been coming for a long time. In a sense, it's a continuation of a shadow conflict that we've seen between Israel and Iran for at least a decade. Most of this was played out before in Syria and Lebanon, as the Israelis sought to interdict Iranian military supplies and other assistance to Hezbollah. We also saw some action actually on the border between Syria and Iraq, because part of the Iranian strategy in the region is to build a network of allies, friends, supporters, whatever you want to call them, in the Greater Levant, so between Iraq and the Mediterranean. And they were very successful at it. And I always thought the problem was that Israel's strategic environment in the region was getting worse. The Israelis could slow down the rate of Iranian expansionism through its friends and allies, through Hezbollah, Kateb, Assad, al-Haq, Kateb, Hezbollah, and so forth, and the various Syrian militias, but it couldn't actually stop them. And after the 2006 war, I was in Jerusalem at the time when that happened, Hezbollah successfully reconstructed itself. Equipped itself with much better ballistic missiles, which of course were an issue in the JCPOA negotiations, with better guidance systems, and acquired significant combat experience in Syria. And I couldn't see how Israel dealt with this threat, or could tolerate it in the long term, because Iran's campaign of attrition against Israel, the ring of fire, as it were, was getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And I always thought that there would be a war. I thought the war was going to be in Lebanon, basically, rather than down in Gaza. I think it is true that the main competition in the region today is between Israel and Iran. I think at one point Saudi Arabia was part of this competition. Certainly between about 2015 and 2019, 2020, the Iranian strikes on the Aramco oil installations. But Saudi Arabia has sort of stepped back from that. And I want to talk about Saudi Arabia in a minute because that's important because of the economic dimensions to this conflict regionally. But now it is Israel and Iran. That's certainly how Israeli policymakers see it. They see the Palestinian issue as subsidiary to this. They see Hamas as essentially sustained by Iran. I mean, you can argue about Hamas's position within Palestinian society and so forth. But in material terms, I think that is undeniably true. So the choice now in front of Israel is how do they combat the threat from Iran rather than just Hezbollah and Hamas? My guess is that they think that they need to take Hezbollah down in some way. They certainly need to prevent Hamas becoming the ruling authority again in Gaza or posing a military threat from Gaza. And they probably want to prevent Hezbollah from reconstituting militarily in the south of Lebanon. I think these are going to be extremely hard to do without a political endgame. I mean, it's a question that David Petraeus used to pose in Iraq. How does this end? We're all familiar with Clausewitz's doctrine that war is continuation of politics by the means. Erich von Ludendorff, in his Total War, which he publishes, I think, in 1937, says that politics is a continuation of war by other means. He reverses it. And I think in the Israeli case, that's true. You cannot simply attain your goal, which is security, national security, long-term enduring national security in the region, simply by war. You can do quite a lot with war, but you need a political settlement. Now, is there a political settlement available between Israel and Iran? No. Is there a political settlement available between Israel and the Palestinians? Yes. Do I think this is a first-order issue? I think it's actually become a second-order issue. But I think it's a sort of issue. It's important because you need to have a settlement of the Palestinian issue, Palestinian self-determination, to get to the more important things in the region. And for me, the most important thing in the region is economic transformation, the economic transformation of the Gulf, and particularly Saudi Arabia. The trouble with Saudi Arabian Vision 2030 is that you cannot achieve, in my view, the goals of Vision 2030 when you have conflict raging in the north and you have conflict in the south with the Houthis, or a national security threat in the south. I mean, whether you think there's conflict going on, there is conflict going on in Yemen. It's not the same sort of conflict we saw 3 years ago, but it's there, and the Houthis represent a threat. There's also conflict in Sudan, of course. It's something that we very rarely talk about, which is quite as savage as anything we see to the north. And I think it poses a dilemma for the Gulf states as well. Can you do this without reconstituting not just the Palestinian political system, but the Israeli political system? No, you have to reconstitute both. This is something that Israelis themselves will talk about. I mean, there was a lot of interesting polling around. There's polling that Khalil Shikaki does on Palestinian opinion. Khalil Shikaki runs the most reputable Palestinian polling organization out of Ramallah. Dalia Scheindlin and others in Israel, and of course the Arab Barometer. And there's a lot of interesting material there on attitude. Actually, if you look historically over the data sets of the last 15 or 20 years, support for a two-state solution or some sort of settlement between Israel and Palestine goes up when there is quiet. Support for Hezbollah in Lebanon goes down when there is quiet. It goes up among non-Shia when there is conflict, and particularly when the Israelis occupy parts of South Lebanon, which of course they did from 1982 to the early 2000s to 2002. And then now I see on Twitter that the Israelis have actually raised the Israeli flag over a part of southern Lebanon, which is not an entirely sensible thing to do, I don't think. So I think, you know, if you could get to the point where the wars, the conflict ends, and there is a political horizon of some sort, then Israel will ultimately be more secure. To make this happen, they're going to need a lot of things to happen. They're going to need actually a new sort of government in Israel. They're going to need an absolute guarantee of US military and security support in perpetuity. And I think behind some of what we're seeing in the region is uncertainty about US intentions, about whether they intend to stay in the region or not, which is an interesting issue, of course, for the Turkish side of all of this. That's a long way away. I've always thought this conflict is going to run and run. I never thought it was going to be a matter of months. And I still don't think it's going to be a matter of months. There's a lot of people who will say that the Israelis want to make as much progress as they can before the US elections in November, or the change of president in January. Maybe what I've seen are the actions of the Netanyahu government. And the action, in terms of continuing the war, this is actually very popular among Israelis, certainly in Lebanon, less so in Gaza now. And Gallant is very bullish about pursuing war. My guess is it's going to go on beyond that. And I don't think, people say the United States needs to pressure Israel. The Biden administration hasn't. I don't think it can. And if you get Trump, God knows what's going to happen in the Trump administration. But if it's Harris, my guess is that she will continue the policies of the Biden administration on all of this. The Turkish angle to all of this. Yeah, Turkish angle. I just want to talk about the Turkish angle because this is, if you look back about 10 years, maybe 15 years, Turkey had a very interesting set of policies in the region, and actually was having quite a lot of success. It had a very effective Kurdish policy up in the north of Iraq, which was designed to create equities among the Kurds, among the Turkmen of Nineveh and Kirkuk, and re-establish a position economically but also politically in large parts of northern Iraq, which historically had been very sympathetic to the Ottomans. Then it changed, and there's an interesting question of why it changed. Quite a lot of this is to do with domestic Turkish politics, which I don't fully understand, and it then fell apart a bit. And I think that Erdoganist Davutoglu sort of drive to spread Turkish influence throughout the Arab Middle East hit the buffers. And I think the same happened in Libya, where the Turks gambled on Misrata and the Misrata militias, and that failed. Libya, in any case, is a marginal player in all of this. I think the issue for the Turks now, a lot of it is centered around where the Americans go in the Middle East. So there's negotiations with between the Iraqi government and the US over further withdrawals of US military trainers, which is what they basically are, and some intelligence operatives in Iraq, excluding Kurdistan, which is a slightly different issue, and indeed in northeastern Syria, which is a separate issue, where the US have essentially underpinned the YPG, the SDF. Now, these are neuralgic issues for Erdogan and his government, and I understand why, the association between the SDF, the YPG, and the PKK. I think what looked like a winning position 10 years ago looks much less like a winning position now for the Turks. And there's the issue of Idlib as well, and what happens there. I think if the Americans were to withdraw, and whether this conflict accelerates or decelerates the American withdrawal from the Middle East, or the desire of the Americans, and there are a lot of Americans who will say, to hell with the Middle East, it's all too difficult, we need to get out. If they do get out, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for individual actors in the region, including Turkey, to come to achieve a new balance of force and a new balance of power. I'll shut up there. That's my 5 minutes, I think.
No, it was excellent. Thank you very much. And thanks also for giving this overview and the bleak future that is awaiting us, unfortunately. And I think now Dimitar will explain some of the questions that you've asked Turkish foreign policy change in the Middle East. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yaprak. And I feel a bit humbled here to explain to you, of all people, and other fellow Turkish experts about their own country. I'm a bit of an outsider as well, although I come from a place that was part of the Ottoman Empire, so maybe I can offer my 2 kurush of wisdom about Turkish foreign policy and indeed domestic affairs. My marching orders is not to look at the situation now, but project back into the past, what Turkey did in the Middle East, but also more broadly in foreign policy, and then to work out some trends in Turkish strategic thinking and the way Turkey acts in international politics. And I promise I'll end up saying something about the current situation as well, without stealing the show from Selin Hoxha. So one thing about Turkey, thinking about its foreign policy behavior, is that two broad paradigms at play, and people have written about it extensively. One is the internationalist paradigm, where Turkey is a leader, can push forward with economic integration, soft power, outreach. Multilateralism is really important in this vision, where Turkey actually could be a leader in its neighborhood, be it the Middle East, or be it Eurasia or the Balkans. So for lack of a better word, you can call it a liberal paradigm or multilateralist paradigm. There's another way Turkey has historically approached its neighbor, which is much more hawkish, where neighbors are a source of danger, a threat. The Kurdish issue in its all permutations over the decades is a perfect example, where the regions next to Turkey, adjacent to Turkey, could be hosting a serious threat to Turkish sovereignty. And that's why historically Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, especially before the AKP era, had looked at its neighbors as a problem, as a source of threat. And of course, the implication policy-wise is that you have to use hard power to contain the neighborhood and to try to fend off whatever challenges to your territorial integrity and sovereignty emanate from those places. And that's a paradigm we associate with the military in the old days, but it hasn't run its course, as we shall see in a tiny bit. And it's sometimes people refer to this lone wolf syndrome, that Turkey is alone in this world. It's a tough place. You have to punch hard if you want to be respected, and you cannot trust even your closest allies, maybe with the exception of Azerbaijan, but that came in the 90s. There was no Azerbaijan before that, obviously. Now, how did that play out over time? I see the pendulum effect, and I would be curious to see Selin, Eprak, and Zia what they think about it. In the post-Cold War era, in the days of Turgut Özal, and I've done some writing in my book on Erdogan. I mean, it's called Turkey and Erdogan, but actually discusses earlier periods as well. The liberal multilateralist paradigm, Turkey's soft power, economic power, had some sway over the government. Turkey saw the opportunity to push forward with all those policies. I mean, remember when they joined the Organization for Islamic Conference, for instance, but also people in that period were really bullish about the prospect of Turkey pushing forward its model of governance and promoting trade and integration. But then we had a swing in the other direction by the mid-90s. In the time of political turmoil in Turkey with the short-lived coalition government, the military, the security apparatus was much more influential. We had a couple of crises down the road, notably the one with Greece over Karabakh/Emir, this islet, but also in Syria in 1998 when Turkey threatened to invade Syria. And this has come back, of course, now with the Russians saying, you know what, you signed this memorandum in Adana at that time. You should probably return to it as a way to re-engage with the Assad regime over fighting the Kurds and finding a modus vivendi with the regime. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So there was this moment when the lone wolf hawkish fortress Turkey paradigm was dominant. And then you had the opposite with the early AKP, right? It's not only because Turkey became much more focused on domestic reform, democratization, and the EU played the role, but also because economic growth and opportunities opened in the neighborhood became so much salient in Turkish thinking in 2000s. I mean, I do remember with some nostalgia that those days where there was much more hope in the Middle East, but also in Turkish domestic affairs, and seemed that sky was the limit. Even when Turkey was received the cold shoulder from the EU, if you talk to policymakers in Ankara, but also fellow academics and think tankers, there was this idea that Turkey could promote something similar in the Middle East. Remember the Shamgen which is the local Schengen and all those multilateral and bilateral trade agreements, investment. I mean, northern Iraq, the Kurdish regional government would be a huge part of it.
Yeah.
So the paradigm of engagement and soft power was really powerful at the time because we lived probably in a much more benign environment, let's be honest. Now that changed with the failure of the Arab Spring, definitely. Turkey's failure to transform the regional order. There was this bullish talk by Davutoglu, but not only, that Turkey could lead change and condition the emergence of like-minded regimes in places like Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Libya. The reality was much harsher. Syria was the focal point where Turkey was basically thwarted by players like Iran, but also Russia acting in tandem. And with the rise of the Kurdish insurgency, the old paradigm of Turkey being threatened gained some traction. And it also tallies with domestic developments, the failed coup attempt, the change in the coalition behind Erdogan, the shift towards a more nationalist thinking and policy. It all comes together. The backlash against Syrian refugees is a huge part of the story. That if you look at Turkish opinion polling, the initial welcome is long sort of overspent itself, and now there's pressure on political parties to get rid of as many Syrians as possible in the shortest period of time. The building of a wall along portions of the Syrian border, the interventions, the buffer zone that got established, clearly, and also the unilateralist foreign policy that after 2016 Turkey embarked upon with military interventions, not just in Syria, but also in Libya and in a way in Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh. That was a phase where the hard power paradigm took precedence, I think. And that's one question now with those resets we have. Mm-hmm. Are we swinging back, at least correcting the course towards a more of the old positive sum thinking? For instance, Turkey being involved in the reconciliation with Armenia and Azerbaijan. But that's a question, of course, I would like to put on the table. Now, I think what's different now in this last phase that Turkey is entering, we definitely are past this moment of Turkey going it alone, because we hit the limits in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in Libya, everywhere else. The resets, but also the economic situation in Turkey pushes Turkey in this direction that has to be much more cooperative. But I think also foreign policy in Ankara has changed dramatically since the old days. Turkey sees itself as an independent power in a growing competitive world where dogs eats dog, even if there is this swing back to a more liberal, quote-unquote, thinking. The world has changed itself. The wars in in Ukraine and in Gaza are portrayed as well. And Turkey is not putting its eggs in one basket. It wants to be autonomous. It wants to be the interlocutor with the West, but also with the Chinese and the Russians. And this reflects this idea that we're transitioning to a world of multipolar setup where regional powers play a role. But what I want to say also, and this is the penultimate thing I'll to bring to the table, is that Turkey, in terms of the big picture, occupies an interesting place. It's not a revisionist power. Sometimes my fellow think tankers in Europe think about Russia, Turkey, and the rest as those threatening others. It has a stake in the current order, at least in Europe, and maybe in the Middle East as well, because of the rapprochements. So it has NATO membership, advanced relationship with the EU. It's not there to shake things up the way Putin does. But it seems to me that it's purchasing ticket to a future world order. that it might emerge in a decade or 2 decades. And the decision to join the BRICS, of course, this is highly symbolic, doesn't mean anything, is a claim that maybe there is another world out there and Turkey has to find its place. So it's one leg in the old order and one leg in the next. Final thought about the war. I mean, Turkey finds itself in an interesting situation because there is no love lost for Iran. Iran is an adversary. Again, Syria was a bruising experience for the Turks. So if the Iranians are cut down to size, that's not the worst outcome. Same, probably if you ask people in Riyadh, they think about it. But again, there is no cause to celebrate if people get killed and if there is the prospect of an old regional war in the Middle East that might drag Turkey in. So Turkey, unfortunately, cannot impact the course of events. I think, and I stand to be corrected, is a secondary player in this situation. And there are opportunities if Iran loses, but also there are serious challenges for Turkey. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a few points to add to what Sir John Jenkins and Dimitar said, and then I will talk about Turkey's stance. Do you hear me?
I think you need to maybe, yeah.
Okay.
Can you put it closer to your?
How is it now? Okay.
That's good. If you can speak into the microphone though, because otherwise, when you guys sort of like look at each other, we're missing some of.
Okay.
Some of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a few points to add to what Sir Jenkins and Dimitar said, and then I will talk about Turkey's stance on the war in Gaza. I agree with Sir John that the war in Gaza was never a simple military confrontation between Israel and Hamas. It was always larger than that, and it was part of the ongoing proxy war between Israel and Iran, and we understood it more clearly, we saw it more clearly as the great powers got involved directly in the conflict. But was it the plan all along? I'm not sure, but Hamas's attack on October 7 presented an opportunity for Israelis to shelve down the plans they have been working for so many years. So we don't know how this is going to play out in the end, but as Dimitar mentioned, Turkey's decision to actively engage in the Syrian civil war constituted a serious break from its traditional Middle East policy, which rested on the principle of non-interfering other countries' internal affairs. And this foreign policy shift in the wake of the Arab protests not only caused economic setbacks, but also led to Turkey's isolation in the region. Acknowledging the damage, Turkish policymakers reversed course and launched a diplomatic campaign to mend Turkey's broken ties with countries in the region. This process, which still continues today, aims to expand Turkey's network of allies, attract capital and investment badly needed for the economy, boost trade, facilitate energy cooperation, and ultimately reposition Turkey as a mediator in resolving conflicts. This is the outline of Turkey's goals in the Middle East today. In a sense, Turkey is reclaiming the diplomatic and economic profile it had in the early 2000s. However, the return is not so easy, not only because Turkey is facing economic problems, but the regional power dynamics have also changed. Still, the regional political landscape today presents both opportunities and challenges for Turkey. Parallel to Washington's pivot to Asia, the perceived U.S. retreat from the Middle East has been driving countries in the region to fix their problems on their own, independently from the United States, in a way to reduce their reliance on Washington. Developments like the Gulf countries' decision to lift the embargo on Qatar or Chinese-mediated Saudi-Iran normalization are steps taken in that direction. So is Turkey's foreign policy reset. in my perspective, Turkey is trying to prepare itself for a post-American Middle East order as it seeks to diversify regional partnerships through diplomacy and trade. At the same time, it is trying to secure its borders at a time when US forces are planning to withdraw from Iraq and considering a similar move in Syria. Of course, we have seen in the past that the more the US administrations try to disentangle themselves from the Middle East, the more they are pulled back, Gaza being the latest example of this. But the course of the war also highlights Washington's waning influence over regional actors in terms of affecting a political outcome. And in this backdrop, Turkey finds a relatively permissive environment to chart its own course. And I'm saying this with regard to its support for Hamas. Regardless of which party wins the US presidential elections in November, the America First trend is likely to endure and will continue to shape US foreign policy. While the Gulf countries would be focusing on their own economic transformation. And of course, we have the ongoing war in Ukraine, and we don't know how things are going to play out on that front. So as we move towards a multipolar order or disorder, whatever you want to name it, the international system allows middle powers like Turkey to pursue a more flexible foreign policy agenda. And this applies to Turkey's Israel policy as well. From a historical perspective, Turkey's relations with Israel has always been a crucial factor in its relations with the West. So much so that maintaining friendly ties with Israel has been considered an indicator of Turkey's Western orientation. It is not a coincidence, therefore, that the deterioration of Turkish-Israeli relations from 2008 onwards follows a parallel path to Turkey's growing quest for strategic autonomy. Given the special relationship between the United States and Israel, maintaining cordial ties with Israel have always facilitated a channel for Turkey to influence Washington, to gain support from the pro-Israel lobbies in the US Congress. Lately, however, what I observe is that Ankara seems to have taken a different approach and is instead seeking to leverage its support for Ukraine in exchange for maintaining its solidarity with Hamas at all costs. It is worth mentioning that President Erdogan sent the protocol for Sweden's accession into NATO to the Turkish parliament for ratification only a week after Israel launched its military operation in Gaza. This was a clear signal that Ankara would adopt a tougher stance toward Israel and escalate its rhetoric. A second observation on Turkey's foreign policy shift is that ideology is making a comeback in Turkish foreign policy, which has been downplayed for a while in order to carry out the normalization process that Dimitar mentioned. Decision makers' ideological perspectives shape how they perceive and respond to changing realities in the region, and this often leads to miscalculation, unfortunately. Very briefly on Turkey's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Turkey has consistently supported a two-state solution in line with the UN Security Council decisions, and was one of the first countries to recognize Palestine in 1988. Yet Turkey's sympathy for the Palestinian cause did not prevent it from cooperating with Israel, even though periodic escalation of violence between Israelis and Palestinians did strain Turkey's relations with Israel. And what sets the AKP government apart from its predecessors is its pro-Hamas stance in this Palestinian conflict, which causes resentment on the Israeli side. Having said that, Turkish-Israeli relations have been on a positive trajectory until the war broke out in Gaza. President Erdogan adopted a balanced, moderate tone in the wake of Hamas's October 7 attacks, expressed his sympathy for Israelis' losses, and advised restraint to both sides. And shortly, in a short while, of course, Ankara then shifted to an increasingly anti-Israel, pro-Hamas stance, as Israel launched its military campaign, and we are familiar with the rest of the story. Ankara's shift of tone led to its exclusion from the diplomatic negotiation. And when some of you may ask, why does Turkey stick to this strategy, which obviously limits its area of maneuver? I would say partly because of domestic political considerations. Israel's conduct of the war, which defies international norms and regulations, has united people across different political spectrums in Turkey. Therefore, adopting a defiant tone against Israel not only helps Erdogan to mobilize his constituency, but also appeals to the Arab street and the global South. Erdogan has been criticizing the Western countries for their complacency in providing an unwavering support to Israel while ignoring Palestinians' plight. And by doing so, he aims to rally international community around the Palestinian issue to pressure Israel to agree to a ceasefire. So when we look at President Erdogan's recent statements, in which he frames Hamas as a force defending Turkey against Israel, and hints at Turkey's potential intervention in Gaza. These statements appeal to domestic audience, obviously, and they may be tactical, but it also signifies a shift in Turkey's positioning in the region, in the sense that these statements cast Turkey as a balancer actor, even if at the rhetorical level, casts Turkey as a balancer actor against Israel in the region, which is a very novel development. And these remarks also reinforce the perception as if Turkey is siding with Iran, which I find misleading, and they're not true, but I should perhaps end here with a teaser remark and we can come back to that. Thank you.
Great.
Great, thank you. I stand between you and the drinks, so I'm going to keep it short so we have more time for a discussion. Look, I mean, it's been fascinating to observe Turkey, but not just Turkey, actors in the Middle East, but not just in the Middle East, in Europe and the world, on how a lot of what we have assumed about peace and war, security, stability has evolved for the last 5, 6, 7 years, right? So depends on when you want to rewind the clock to. Is it 2008 invasion of Georgia that actually woke up countries, or should have woken up, that actually were about to enter a new phase in the region with Russia and Russian kind of policies and assertions? Is it the Arab Spring, the Syrian war? Is it invasion of Ukraine in 2014? Don't forget, it started in 2014, not in 2022, or is it then? But even in Europe today, even Japan tripling its defense budget. So there has been actually a global kind of recognition that we entered a very insecure era, right? And a lot of countries, including the UK, including European member states and US, have realized, right, our assumptions on diplomacy, on boundaries of how to solve these problems are not really holding. So your defense investment matters, your alliances matter, your kind of stakeholders in this conversation matter. And the war in Ukraine revealed a lot of weaknesses for Europe, for the UK, and for Turkey and others as well too. So when you look at how Turkish foreign policy logic went from talking about soft power, trade, engagement, legacy, culture. I was in Cairo when Erdogan first went during the Mubarak years, actually. And it was amazing to think about then versus now, right? And a lot of what Turkey does, well, how Turkey reads the region is actually from a defense and security perspective now, right? So we moved on from that era into an era of instability. So there is some that is not new, and there's some stuff that is new in this conversation. What do I mean by that? Consecutive Turkish governments for the last 40, 50 years, for example, have talked about the need for a strong Turkish military defense posture, the need for nationalizing the defense industry, right? Even before the invasion of Cyprus question and the blockade Turkey faced in the 70s, Bill Clinton brought new sanctions and limitations on Turkey. Germany has always been a tricky partner. And lately, you realize with Sweden over the NATO accession, Turkey has always felt the need for nationalizing. I can't say that word today. It's too late. Its defense, right? Because it always believed that its over-dependence and reliance on the Western Bloc, even during the Cold War, was actually a positive in some sense. You hosted American nuclear weapons, you had the NATO membership, you had Article 5. But whenever you needed the alliance to be with you, you were not getting it, right? Germany was really reluctant to send missiles to defend. And when you need ammunition, they're not happy to. US doesn't want to give you that kit, that upgrade. It's limiting you, and etc. I think in 2000s with Turkish economic boom and a huge series of agreements, it's a very structural question too. Turkey found itself, capable of pursuing nationalization and at accelerated speed that was not possible before. So in that sense, that you see now as a trend where Turkey is actively nationalizing its defense, procuring a lot more at home than ever before, is actually not new. Turkey reading the Middle East from a perspective of PKK-related groups in Iraq and Syria, the need to take proactive position operations is also not new, right? Like Dimo said and like Sir John said, and operations in Iraq, operations in Syria, Adana agreements, similar things with Iraq are not new, right? But what is new within this conversation is A, capability. What I mean by that is both, the drones that now you see are obviously in everybody's lips, but missiles, armored vehicles, a lot of high-tech stuff, which Turkey didn't really have before, now it has. And also capability of knowing how to use this thing. So please never, if you never worked in a defense kind of setting, you will always get more attracted about the shiny kits, right? They are not as important as how you use them, how you incorporate them, how you operate them in the field. Like there's not a single item in any world military that gives them a magical power, right? Oh, how many jets do you have? 10. We have 15. This is not a game of Uno, right? So how you incorporate your defense and use it, mobilize it, and your human resources, your operational experience is as important as whether you have an F-35 jet, right? It doesn't matter beyond a certain level. So what Turkey has learned in operations in Syria and Iraq for the last 10 years has been a huge leap forward operationally. We can discuss that more, working through proxies, working directly, evolvement of Turkish National Intelligence Agency, huge budget increase, huge signals intelligence, human intelligence, and proxy operations, paramilitary structures. Those are really brand new assets for Turkey. When you have the capability, what happens? Your posture changes, right? Because you're not relying on a permission from merely US to be able to do certain things, because you can do. If you remember, well, you wouldn't, but Turkey was buying drones from Israel. The relationships went sour at one of the against cycles. The drone company walked out. Turkey was left with the kit, right? So you can't operate that drone because your relations went. Now you have your own drones. You can fly them wherever you want to. You don't need US parts. To a certain level, you still do. But you realize when you have the capability and the know-how and how to use it, you are much more likely to use it, right? And you're much more likely to see it as a part of your diplomatic toolkit in a region that is unstable, in a region where hard power speaks. US takes a decision on Syria to arm YPG, even though diplomatically you raise all of your kind of wild cards to say, don't do this. The only way you can hinder US policy, which will harm your interests, is to be present in Syria, is to operate in Syria. And that's, again, coming out of, by the way, NATO doctrine. It's not coming out of any kind of neo-Ottoman and fantasy. It's coming out of military doctrines within NATO. Forward operating and denying an adversary land is not really a wild kind of idea. So what happens within this context is obviously also trade, right? This is new. Turkish defense has, for the last 20 years, 30 years, 15 years, done a really good job in agreeing into procurement processes that are shared, like production of F-16s in Turkey. So Turkish companies could be part of it, Turkish state could be part of it. But increasingly, Turkey having its own products to sell. Before drones, by the way, Turkish rockets we're really doing good. Armored vehicles, naval vessels, and high-tech softwares and lenses. There's a lot that has been going on beyond the kind of news headlines. And once you have those, this is good for your economy. Last year, Turkish defense exports increased more than 22% on year. That's a huge increase, right, in terms of your trade volume. It's past 5.5 billion. And in fact, there's some new deals that are going to rocket that a lot more. And when you look at it, it gives you trade, prosperity agenda, as we call it in the UK, but it also gives you an opening, an influence, a normalizing kind of channel. The Turkish deal with Saudi Arabia last year, $3.5 billion worth of drone purchase and operations and maintenance with Bayraktar. That's a huge trade deal, right? And with Saudi Arabia, if you remember, Mohammed bin Salman and President Erdogan are not really on kind of personal good terms as such, but now you can see how that defense trade is becoming a normalizing factor. With UAE, again, a huge purchase of Turkish drones, with Oman, even armored vehicles, with Qatar, recently more, again, Turkish naval vessels and etc., with Egypt even. So now Turkey now, all of a sudden, emerges from a country that is vulnerable to external actors, denying it operating space and denying it kit. It's now is able to sell and use that for influence. Now, influence is a tricky thing, right? UK has been selling defense assets to the Middle East for decades, right? To what extent you can actually utilize that to shape foreign policy outcomes? Very limited, right? US maybe has a bit more because of the agreements and laws, but even then you see the limits of it. So Turkish exports are one thing. Whether Turkey can translate that into influence in the Middle East in the long run is another thing. But what is really interesting to observe is how Turkey as a middle power now has internalized a paradigm that in today's world, unless you have a forward capacity and capability to be able to assert yourself, you won't be able to be heard diplomatically. And then finally, there is also a domestic political context of it, which is, some people use the word techno-nationalism, so I'm not a big fan of buzzwords. Buzzwords are great for op-eds and Twitter, but analytically, they really take you down a rabbit hole, like Neo-Ottomans. What is that, a furniture brand? But there is an element of when you have those new technologies, drones and aircraft carrier, which isn't really an aircraft carrier, so right, let's park it away. You can also give the sense domestically that you are a strong nation, right? You are kind of breaking new ground, you're achieving new successes, and actually Turkey is a strong nation with a strong military. We will not bow down to US pressure, to German pressure. So there is a domestic political kind of bonus of it, but I do think a lot of Turkish defense posturing is driven by very sensible reading of what's happening around them. It's not really driven by an ideology or some sort of kind of, do you remember the book, Give War a Chance? There was a book like that. It was a very masculine article. It was many, many years ago. Somebody wrote that. Yes, no, this isn't about that kind of a perspective, but it's a lot more reactive than we think. So I'll end there and we can discuss.
Thank you very much. That's marvelous.